Welcome to the deep dive. Ever wonder what those little rumbles beneath California really mean for the future? Today we're looking at our recent Cluster 3 earthquakes in under 12 hours to, understand the bigger picture of seismic activity in the Golden State. Let's get into it.
Okay, so our focus today starts with a magnitude 2.8 quake down in Monterey County. Then, not long after, we saw two more, a 2.8 and a 2.9, closer to San Francisco.
Right.
For context, the Monterey one hit around 4:16 p.m. Eastern Time. The Dublin tremor, that was about 7:58 p.m. ET Tuesday, and then the Orinda one followed maybe 6 hours later. Using Eastern Time just helps keep these reports consistent,
Okay, so pretty small tremors then. For everyone listening, it's probably worth noting that earthquakes in that 2.5 to 5.4 range, Michigan Tech says they're generally felt, but usually only cause minor damage, if any.
Exactly, and thankfully these recent ones didn't lead to any reports of injuries or actual damage.
That's good news.
But what's really interesting, or maybe significant, is where that first quake struck, the San Andreas Fault.
Ah, okay. The big one.
Yeah, that's the massive 800-mile crack in the Earth's crust. And, as the Great California Shakeout always reminds us, it's a major concern because it's, considered overdue for a really significant earthquake. We're talking magnitude 8 or higher, the big one.
And the potential scale of a big one.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? I read estimates that over 39 million people could feel its effects all across the West Coast.
It's staggering. Though that Monterey County quake, even being on the San Andreas, it was relatively deep, 21 miles down.
Okay.
Which might explain why, despite being on that fault, nobody actually reported feeling it through the USGS system. Depth matters a lot.
Right. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, those other two quakes near San Francisco.
Yes, those happened along the Calaveras Fault.
Which is connected, isn't it?
It is. It's basically a branch, part of the wider San Andreas Fault system.
Yeah.
And the Calaveras itself, it's known for generating its own moderate, sometimes large earthquakes. And interestingly, unlike the Monterey one, nearly 2,000 people reported feeling these smaller San Francisco area tremors via the USGS Felt report.
Wow, 2,000 for Quake Center 3.0.
Yeah, it really shows how even seemingly minor events can be widely perceived. It depends a lot on location, depth, and maybe even the time of day.
It really does highlight how interconnected all these geological forces are. And thinking about the San Andreas historically, the last really major events were, 1857?
The Fort Tejon earthquake, yes, magnitude 7.9. Caused ground fissures, damage. I think 2 deaths were reported from that one.
And then, of course, the one everyone knows, 1906, San Francisco.
Also a 7.9, absolutely devastating, widespread destruction, fires, and tragically around 3,000 deaths. It reshaped the city.
So that history naturally leads to the big question, what's next? You mentioned the fault being overdue.
Well, there are varying perspectives. Angie Lux at the Berkeley Seismology Lab, she's expressed being fairly confident we'll see a large earthquake sometime in the next 30 years.
Fairly confident. That sounds significant.
It is. But it's also important to mention Dr. Suhu from the USGS. She points out that the research is actually kind of conflicting on whether there are reliable warning signs, precursory signals before major earthquakes.
Oh.
How so? Some data, some studies, seem to suggest maybe increased smaller quakes beforehand, like foreshocks. But other findings, they just don't show any clear warning pattern at all. It really underscores how complex earthquake prediction still is.
Yeah, it's a constant reminder that even with all our science, predicting when is incredibly difficult. And just to give listeners some perspective on all this activity, California has a lot of earthquakes, right?
Oh, constantly. So far this year alone, there have been over 10,000 quakes recorded up to magnitude 4.6.
10,000.
And within that, about 100 or so were between magnitude 3 and 4, and over 600, like the ones we're discussing, were in that magnitude 2 to 3 range. So these recent ones definitely fit into an ongoing pattern of activity.
It's not like they came out of nowhere.
Not at all. And fundamentally, the cause is always the same, tectonic plate movement. You've got these huge slabs of Earth's crust just grinding past each other.
Like puzzle pieces.
Exactly. Friction builds up massive stress along the edges, the fault lines, and when that stress finally overcomes the rock's strength, bang, they slip suddenly. That releases energy as seismic waves, and that's the earthquake we feel.
Okay, so wrapping this up, these recent relatively small earthquakes, they're basically little reminders of the powerful active geology constantly at work beneath California.
Precisely. One hit on the San Andreas, the fault we always keep an eye on,
Yeah.
and the other two on the Calaveras, a significant branch of that system.
We've touched on the destructive history of these faults and the ongoing science trying to figure out future risks, even with the uncertainty in prediction.
Right. And, considering this constant movement underfoot and the historical context, it makes you think beyond just the shaking itself.
Well, how does this ongoing geological reality, this tectonic dance, subtly shape things? Like the less obvious stuff. How does it influence long-term infrastructure planning or building codes or even just the everyday mindset and resilience of the communities living right on top of these active fault zones? Something to ponder.